Charles de Gaulle Airport, December 23rd. Paris was wrapped in cold, steady rain, and the flickering Christmas lights barely warmed the terminal crowded with tired faces. Between abandoned luggage and flight delay announcements, Claire gripped the strap of her bag tightly. She wore a cocktail dress beneath her grey coat, her mascara smudged like she'd walked out of an old movie. Just hours earlier, she had walked away from the altar in Bordeaux. No note, no explanation. She had taken the first train to Paris. A few rows away, Daniel turned a small velvet box over in his hands. A London-based attorney, he had planned every detail. He would propose to Kayla in New York, where she was spending Christmas with her parents. But his connecting flight to JFK had just been cancelled due to an Atlantic snowstorm. Now he was stranded, stuck in a place that felt like nowhere. They didn't know it yet, but both had just stepped into the most unexpected layover of their lives. Claire spotted the empty seat next to a man in a charcoal coat, head bent over something in his hands. It was the only free space near an outlet. She approached without a word, sitting down with a sigh that escaped her like steam from a cracked teacup. Daniel looked up startled, then offered a polite nod. She didn't smile. Neither did he. Minutes passed. He closed the velvet box and tucked it into his coat. She took out her phone, but had no idea who to call. A loudspeaker crackled. All transatlantic flights remained cancelled. A groan echoed through the terminal. Then came a voice, bright, French, and far too cheerful for the setting. "You two look like ghosts," said a young airport cafe worker, Juliet, as she passed by offering coffee samples. Claire blinked. Daniel chuckled, the sound dry from disuse. "Perhaps we are," he replied. Juliet laughed and walked off, but her interruption had cracked the silence just enough. Claire finally looked at him. "Long day, long year," Daniel said, and something shifted. The hours began to fold over themselves like worn pages of a book. No new flights, no announcements, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional screech of a cleaning cart. Claire and Daniel stayed side by side, not touching, not asking, just being. At some point, Daniel offered her a sandwich from the vending machine. She accepted it without looking up from her book, Le Petit Prince in French. He recognized it immediately. "You're reading that in French?" he asked, surprised. She nodded. "I needed to remind myself that the essential is invisible to the eye." It was the first thing she said with a trace of softness. He leaned back, watching the people around them. This place makes that very easy to believe. As the night deepened, the terminal emptied of sound and people. They shifted positions, using coats as pillows. Claire rested her head against her bag. Daniel offered his scarf. She hesitated, then took it. They didn't talk about where they were supposed to be. They didn't ask the obvious questions. Who are you? What are you running from? Who are you hoping still waits for you? Instead, they shared smaller truths. Claire admitted she hated champagne, but loved how it felt to pop the cork. Daniel confessed he still believed in handwritten letters and had a drawer full of ones he never sent. They didn't laugh loudly, didn't flirt, didn't try to impress each other, but their breathing synchronized. When a baby cried in the distance, Claire instinctively reached over and touched Daniel's arm. He didn't pull away. Later, around 3 a.m., as the lights dimmed slightly and the world softened into half-sleep, Claire whispered, "I never do this. Talk to strangers." Daniel's voice came after a moment. "Neither do I. But maybe we're not strangers. Maybe we're just people who met too late." She turned to him, eyes barely visible in the dim light. "Or just in time," she said. They both fell asleep before they could unpack what that meant. The sun never fully rose that Christmas Eve in Paris. The light that did manage to pierce the terminal windows was grey and hesitant, like it too, wasn't sure it should be there. Claire woke first, her neck aching, but her heart oddly still. She looked over at Daniel, who was still sleeping, jaw clenched even in rest. She stood, walked away quietly, and splashed water on her face in the restroom. Her reflection was a stranger, a runaway bride, an impulsive woman who hadn't told her family, hadn't even answered the dozens of missed calls from Louis. She felt the guilt thicken in her chest. He didn't deserve to be left without an explanation, and yet she didn't regret leaving. Back in the terminal, Daniel was awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Did I miss a flight announcement?" he asked. "No," she said. "Everything's still frozen." Fitting. They wandered together toward the cafe. Juliet wasn't working anymore, replaced by an older man who barely looked up from his espresso machine. Daniel bought 2 coffees and handed one to Claire. They sat by the window, watching the runways disappear into fog. "I was going to propose tomorrow," he said suddenly. Claire's fingers tightened around the cup. Did she know? She knew I was serious. Maybe that's why she went ahead of me. Told me to catch up. Claire stared at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "She flew to New York 2 days ago. Said she wanted to spend time with her parents. I was meant to join her and surprise her there." Claire exhaled slowly. Maybe she didn't want to be surprised. He nodded, almost grateful for her honesty. "And you?" he asked, after a long silence. "I was the one wearing white." He blinked. "I didn't get to the vows," she said. "I got to the car." Daniel didn't speak. Instead, he looked out at the tarmac. Claire followed his gaze. "She's a good man." Claire added, "You mean he?" "No, I meant what I said." Daniel gave a hollow laugh. "So's she." There it was, the strange symmetry of their pain. 2 people who'd tried to do the right thing, only to find themselves stranded between decisions already made and the ones they still couldn't admit to wanting. But something more complicated was forming beneath the surface. A quiet panic. They were still strangers. They still had lives, attachments, people waiting. The terminal was not a world. It was a pause, and pauses end. By midday, the flight board flickered to life. Some flights were reinstated. Others still showed blinking. Read Daniel's flight to New York now read boarding 13:20. Claire's train back to Bordeaux had availability at 15. He looked at her. "Will you go?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. You should talk to him." "So, should you?" Neither moved. Outside, a plane rolled toward the runway. Inside, Claire stood. "I should leave before I say something that ruins this." "Say it anyway," he said, rising. She stared at him. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something there, something too big for this airport to hold. "I don't want to forget you," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then don't." She turned and walked away. He didn't follow. The terminal was a different place without her. The air felt heavier, the announcements sharper, the buzz of people returning to their journeys almost offensive. Daniel stood at the gate until the final call for his flight to New York echoed, like a verdict. He boarded. The flight was quiet. He didn't watch a movie. He didn't read. He stared at the tray table, fingers grazing the edge where her hand might have rested. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he thought about texting Kayla. He didn't. Not because he was unsure, but because now he was. Claire didn't return to Bordeaux. She went to Marseille instead. Booked a last-minute hotel and walked the quiet docks alone, her wedding dress still stuffed in the bottom of her suitcase like a secret she wasn't ready to burn. She answered no calls, not from her parents, not from Louis. Only one message. She typed and deleted over and over. "Did you make it? Are you okay? I didn't want to leave. Nothing ever felt right." In New York, Daniel stood in front of Kayla's brownstone for 20 minutes before turning away. He sent a simple email that night. No blame. just truth. Claire, meanwhile, took a job at a tiny bookshop near the port. She watched the sea each morning, as if it might return something it had taken. They didn't write. They didn't speak. Weeks passed, then a month, and yet neither of them moved on. Because sometimes silence isn't forgetting. Sometimes it's awaiting. It was late February when Claire found the envelope tucked between the pages of Le Petit Prince at the bookshop. Her hands trembled. The handwriting on the front wasn't familiar, but inside was a note, written on the back of a Charles de Gaulle boarding pass. You said the essential is invisible to the eye. But I saw you. Even when I wasn't looking. I flew to New York, but I never really arrived. I left something behind in Paris. Maybe I left the only part of me that mattered. There was no name, just an address in London, scribbled in the corner. She stared at it for hours before calling Juliet. You remember the man I sat next to in the terminal? She asked. Juliet laughed. The one who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. Hard to forget. Claire's voice cracked. He left me a message. Meanwhile, in London, Daniel walked past his usual cafe and paused. On the chalkboard outside was a quote. One sees clearly only with the heart. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He stopped walking, stared at the words, then laughed softly, like someone waking up from a dream they hadn't known they were having. Back in Marseille, Claire booked a train. But life, of course, never makes things that simple. When she arrived at the London address, an elderly woman opened the door. Daniel? Claire asked. The woman smiled kindly. You just missed him. He left for Greece, said he needed to find the sea again. Claire blinked. Greece? He didn't leave an address, the woman added. But he mentioned a lighthouse near Thessaloniki. Said he might stay there for a while. Claire exhaled, a sound between laughter and disbelief. Destiny had given her a clue, just not the whole map. She bought a ticket to Thessaloniki the next morning. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the Aegean, white against the bluest sky Claire had ever seen. Waves crashed gently below, and the scent of salt wrapped around her like memory. She stood with her shoes in her hand, eyes fixed on the narrow path leading up the rocky slope. It had taken her 3 trains, a ferry, and a bus to get here, but none of that mattered now. At the top of the hill, a man was painting. Daniel. He looked different, lighter somehow, though his posture still carried the familiar weight. She didn't speak right away. She watched him, the rhythm of his strokes, the stillness of his breath. Then, as if her presence were something he'd already sensed, he turned. Their eyes met. It took only that. He dropped the brush. It landed. Without a sound. I thought I'd imagined you, he said, his voice raw. Claire stepped closer, heart racing. You left a message. I didn't know if you'd see it. I almost didn't. Silence again. But this time, it pulsed with something alive. I waited in New York, he said. Not for her, for clarity. I thought I'd find it in the city. But it was always in the terminal. In you. Claire swallowed hard. I thought I was running away from something. Turns out I was running toward you. He took her hands, tentative. At first, then with certainty. We don't know each other. Not fully, she said. But I knew your silence. I knew your stillness. I knew your sadness. Daniel's smile was slow, like the sunrise. And I knew your courage. Sitting beside me when you were falling apart. Eating vending machine sandwiches like they were Parisian delicacies. She laughed through a tear. You made them taste that way. He leaned forward, forehead touching hers. Do we do something with this? Or let it stay as the perfect accident it was? Claire didn't hesitate. I didn't come this far to leave. Again, their kiss was not cinematic. It was real, messy, honest. It tasted like salt and relief. It didn't answer every question. But it said yes to starting, to risking, to love that didn't come wrapped in guarantees, but arrived anyway. They sat on the cliff until the sun dipped low, and the lighthouse blinked to life. Not a warning, but a beacon. 3 months later, the lighthouse no longer belonged to Silence. The old keeper had welcomed Daniel's offer to maintain the property, surprised to find someone who respected the quiet, but brought life with him. Daniel painted in the mornings, fixed broken beams by afternoon, and read with Claire by the sea at night. She found a rhythm in translating travel essays for a local publisher and leading spontaneous poetry nights in the village below. Tourists who stumbled upon the cliff often paused, not just for the view, but for the feeling, like the place had been waiting for something, or someone, to fill it with meaning. Locals whispered that the Englishman and the Frenchwoman had rewritten the purpose of the lighthouse. It no longer just warned ships, it brought people in. Claire began leaving short poems on benches and boats, signed only with a tiny drawing of a fox. Children collected them like treasure. Daniel taught a Saturday drawing class to anyone who showed up with a pencil, sometimes using sea stones as canvas. They never spoke of Bordeaux or New York. The world that had abandoned them once was now something they rebuilt, piece by piece, color by color, breath by breath. In the space that once held their doubt, they planted something else. Roots. Dear Daniel, sometimes I think about the terminal, the flickering lights, the cold coffee, the way we didn't speak until the world forced us to. And I realize now, we were never stranded. We were redirected. You once asked if we should leave. That night, as a perfect accident. I'm glad we didn't. I'm glad we chose something messier, something real. I still keep the boarding pass you wrote on. It reminds me that even in places meant for leaving, some things arrive. You were never my destination. You were the reason I stopped running. Yours, Claire. Years later, travelers still ask about the lighthouse with the painted steps and the wildflowers growing through stone. They hear stories of a man who walked away from a proposal and a woman who left her wedding behind, of a kiss beneath a failing, ceiling light and a painting that sold for nothing, yet meant everything. But the real story isn't told aloud. It lives in shared routines. In the fresh paint that never chips. In the way Claire still leaves notes between the pages of borrowed books. In the way Daniel still waits by the cliff at dusk, as if she might arrive all over again, in wind-blown hair and ruined makeup, asking if this seat is taken. And even though she never really left, he still answers, quietly, every time. No, not anymore. Because some love stories don't need grand endings. They only need the choice to stay.